Recording starts.
Hello, good to see you. I'm Sara Rimm-Kaufman. I'm a professor and researcher here at the University of Virginia. And my interests in schools as a context for children's learning have drawn me to the responsive classroom approach. I'm here with Julie Thomas, the lead project manager for the study that I'll be describing. Julie plays a central role in all aspects of project coordination, such as data collection and project management. The Responsive Classroom Efficacy Study has been conducted as collaborative work. Here at UVA, a group of professors, researchers, and professional staff have come together to work on this project. In addition, we have been working with Northeast Foundation for Children, the developers of Responsive Classroom Approach. Also, we have a set of district collaborators. We've been working with a large district in a mid-Atlantic state. Our district collaborators have asked to remain anonymous. I would describe them as a very impressive group of educators who care deeply about children's education. This has been grant-funded work. The grant extends from 2007 and 2012, and the grant came from the U.S. Department of Education. So the findings that I'll be talking about today are preliminary. And what that means is most education research goes through a long peer review process. And at this point, most of the papers that I'll be talking about are somewhere in that long process but aren't in print yet. What that means is that these findings come with the caveat that when we do some reanalyses, they may change. But I think at this point, we have enough information to be able to provide educators with some new information. Okay, let's take a moment to imagine a fourth grade math classroom. This is a lesson that's designed to teach number sense and understanding of large numbers. Students went to a big local park, and they counted the squirrels and the pigeons that they could see in a small area of the park. Now back in their classroom, they're given maps and that show the size of the entire park that they need to estimate from. And they need to estimate how many squirrels and pigeons live in the whole park. So the students are working in groups of 3 or 4, and the teachers ask them to discuss and justify their answers on paper and verbally. This math lesson represents a typical math lesson to teach number sense, estimation, problem solving, and reasoning. There's no doubt that students need to have certain math skills for this lesson to be successful. For example, they need to have some number skills, number sense, and estimation skills. However, think about the way that children are learning and how students are working together to reason and to problem solve. Consider for a moment all of the teacher and student skills, aside from the math, that need to be in place so that this lesson is successful. Students need to know how to work with their peers. They need to keep their attention directed towards the activity. They need to wait their turn to talk. And they also need to be able to listen to each other's ideas. Teachers need to know how to facilitate small group work. They need to know how to support students' development of social skills so the students can work together. They need to be able to how to foster students' autonomy so when the teachers are going from group to group, they can focus on the content of the math instead of focusing on behavior management issues. So this vignette reminds us of our dilemma. Learning in the 4th grade is an intensely social process. And it's an intensely social experience for 4th graders. Teachers feel so pressured to focus on academic achievement that it's easy to overlook the need to teach children the social and emotional skills that they need to do their academic learning. This dilemma raises a question. Will we diminish children's academic achievement if we focus attention on children's social and emotional skills? This question is very important, and it's this question that led me to conduct research on responsive classroom approach. The responsive classroom approach is designed to create classroom environments that are community-oriented, productive, and academically engaging. It's designed to integrate social and academic learning. The responsive classroom approach is focused on how to teach so it can be combined with any curriculum. The responsive classroom approach is comprised of 7 principles and 10 practices. So for example, I'll give a few examples here. So one principle is that the greatest cognitive growth occurs through social interaction. There are 10 practices that emanate from the responsive classroom principles, and I'll give you a few examples of those practices here. One practice is the morning meeting. The morning meeting is a 20 to 30-minute meeting of the entire class, the teacher and the children. The teacher and students gather to greet each other, engage in a group activity, and share news following a set format. Interactive modeling is another practice. It's used to demonstrate key classroom behaviors. So these behaviors may include respectful listening or transitions between activities, for example. So teachers guide students to observe and notice key aspects of those classroom behaviors so that they can learn them. Academic choice is yet another responsive classroom practice. So a teacher-guided approach, responsive classroom, or academic choice is a teacher-guided approach that gives students a choice of the ways of doing their academic work. So the teacher lays out the learning objectives and then provides different materials or different ways of engaging in the learning. Afterwards, in the beginning of an academic choice, there's a planning period between the teacher and the students, then the students go and do the work, and then there's a reflection period after the academic choice. So you might be asking, why conduct research on the responsive classroom approach? I'll describe a couple reasons here. First, the responsive classroom approach is widely used. More than 120,000 teachers have received training in the approach, and so it's an approach that's used by many teachers. Second, schools make trade-offs when they spend money in various programs and activities. That means that educators often find themselves in a challenging position of making decisions about using the responsive classroom approach compared to other strategies, curricula, or approaches. So we know that the responsive classroom principles and practices are theoretically well-grounded. However, I think it's very important to provide educators with an understanding of the scientific evidence that supports and questions the use of the approach. So for that reason, we conducted the Responsive Classroom Efficacy Study, or RCES. And today I'll be talking about RCES in relation to the 4 most common questions that come up from educators about the responsive classroom. First, does the responsive classroom approach improve student outcomes? Second, does the responsive classroom approach work equally well for children from a variety of different backgrounds? And third, how does a responsive classroom look different from a regular classroom? Then we'll come to the final question, which is, what is the most important point to keep in mind to know whether the responsive classroom approach is right for my school? And that's a question that we'll cover towards the end of this talk. So this is a logic model that describes the theory of change and helps us come up with our prediction for what could happen when teachers use the responsive classroom practices. So on the left side of the logic model, you see the intervention components, and on the right side of the logic model, you see the outcomes of the intervention. And so what this logic model describes is that training, involving training and coaching in responsive classroom approach, could produce teacher change, the use of responsive classroom practices in the classroom. In turn, the use of responsive classroom practices could change the classroom experience for children and teachers. And so here we expect that we could see improved quality of classroom interactions. In turn, the improved quality of classroom interactions could predict improved achievement. So this logic model helps us think through what could happen when teachers are using the responsive classroom approach. Now, one of the first things that I need to point out at this point is whether training actually does produce teacher change. And we've gathered a lot of data on the 350 teachers, and we have quite strong evidence that training and coaching in responsive classrooms does produce the use of responsive classroom practices in those classrooms. That's indicated by the yellow arrow, or the orange arrow on your screen. me describe the study design. So this is a randomized control trial. We had 24 elementary schools in a large mid-Atlantic district. And all of these schools were willing to be in a study of the responsive classroom approach. We randomly selected about half of those schools to go into an intervention group, and they received responsive classroom practices right away. The other half had to wait 3 years until the study was over to be trained in responsive classroom. So our participants in the study were 2,900 students and the 350 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers. And what we did is we followed a group of participants from when they were in the spring of their 2nd grade year. So that was the baseline time when we gathered data on our participants. So spring of 2nd grade, and we followed the kids through 3rd grade, through 4th grade, and through the end of 5th grade. And while we followed those children, we also followed their teachers as they progressed through the various grades until they got to the spring of 5th grade. During that time, the teachers at the intervention schools, as well as the administrators, received comprehensive training in the responsive classroom approach. So all of that training was provided by the Northeast Foundation for Children. And this training involved a week-long workshop, both RC1 and RC2. The training involved on-site training, coaching, and workshops. This included in-school coaching as well as one-day workshops. The training involved books and materials online. So the school libraries got a complete selection of books, and the teachers involved in the study and the principals also received a set of books. And then there were also materials made available to teachers and administrators online. Also, there was support given to administrators. This included administrator network meetings, planning sessions, distance support, and coaching. So this is a very comprehensive package of responsive classroom training for these schools. Let me tell you a little bit about our approach to data collection. So we used teacher surveys. We asked teachers about their use of responsive classroom practices, and we asked this both in the intervention group and in the control group. We did classroom observations. There we observed the use of responsive classroom practices, as well as the quality of teacher-student interactions in math and in the morning. We also used a measure to look at standards-based math practices in the classroom by conducting videotaped observations and then watching those videos later. To measure achievement, we used standardized achievement tests. To look at achievement initially, we used the Stanford 10, then later we used the state standardized test when the kids were in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And then we have other school, teacher, and student variables that are beyond the scope of this webinar, but that we gathered for a variety of different reasons. So that brings us to our questions. And so first we'll ask the first question, does the responsive classroom approach improve student outcomes? So here's what we did. We compared students at intervention versus control schools in 5th grade achievement. In doing that, our analyses used 2nd grade achievement and other student and school characteristics as what we call statistical control variables, or as variables that we put into the model to consider them in the analysis. What our findings showed is that random assignment alone did not relate to achievement. However, random assignment to the RC group, to the intervention group that is, predicted the use of responsive classroom practices. And in turn, the use of those responsive classroom practices predicted achievement. So you might ask, well, what was the relationship? What was the magnitude of the relationship between the use of responsive classroom practices and achievement? Our effect sizes were 0.26 for math and 0.30 for reading. This is a little bit of a cumbersome way to explain them, but it's roughly 1/4 of a standard deviation in the test scores in math and about 1/3 of a standard deviation of the test scores in reading. So these findings need to be considered with an important caveat. We cannot say that responsive classroom caused gains in achievement, but RC caused use of responsive classroom practices, and in turn, the use of those practices produced those gains in achievement. Let me describe this with this scatter plot. This will make things a little bit more clear. Okay. It's not working here. Okay. Okay, here on the vertical axis, we have math scores averaged for each school. Now look at the horizontal axis. That's the average use of responsive classroom practices for the teachers at each school. So each point in this figure represents a single school. Now look at all of the points together. Notice how all those points taken together resemble a diagonal line. That represents a linear relationship between the use of responsive classroom practices and the average math scores at the schools. Now, there's one more detail to consider. So notice how there are two different shapes. There are the blue circles, those are the control schools, and then there's the green triangles, and those are the treatment schools. So what you can see is that, so let's direct our attention to this low quadrant, indicated by the arrow. Okay, now it's working. And this is an area of low responsive classroom practices and low achievement where you see more of the control condition schools. And then up here, with the second arrow, you can see higher responsive classroom practices relating to higher student achievement for those schools in the treatment group. This is what this figure shows for math achievement. It shows this relationship between use of responsive classroom practices and achievements. And here is a similar figure for reading achievement, showing the same pattern. Now, one thing to keep in mind is in conducting these analyses, we account for many other variables such as free and reduced price lunch and other variables that we know are important in predicting achievement. Without those, you don't see this clean linear relationship, but with those, you do see this pattern. Okay, so let's move on to our second question. Does the responsive classroom approach work equally well for children from a variety of different backgrounds? So what we consider here is we consider children who are eligible for free and reduced lunch compared to those who are not eligible. And we also consider children who were low in their initial achievement. So children who were achieving below the 25th percentile at the baseline time, which would have been the spring of second grade. And here's what we learned. We learned that there are equivalent associations for students eligible for free and reduced price lunch and those not eligible. And we also learned that there's a stronger relation between use of responsive classroom practices and math achievement for students with low initial ability. We saw that finding in math, but not in reading. But so that brings us to a set of lessons learned. So what have we learned so far? We learned that use of responsive classroom practices was what related to the improved student achievement. We found that our findings about use of responsive classroom practices were similar for math and reading and achievement, for math and reading achievement. We saw equivalent gains regardless of family income, and we found greater gains for children who were lower achieving. Okay, let's go to our next question. How does a responsive classroom look different from a regular classroom? Many people want to know this. I especially want to know this, and we had about 2,000 tapes that we've watched, and that gives us some information about how a responsive classroom looks different. Okay, so first we'll turn our attention to understanding the quality of teacher-student interactions. We use the classroom assessment scoring system to look at the quality of those teacher-student interactions. So this measure helped us understand emotional support, teachers' emotional support for the students in the classroom. This looked at teachers' sensitivity towards students and also teachers' knowledge or understanding of individual differences among students. It also looked at evidence of students showing positive social behaviors towards each other. That was emotional support. We also measured classroom organization. That involved whether teachers use more proactive as compared to more reactive approaches to managing classroom management issues. And it also referred to how productive the classroom appeared, as well as the kinds of learning formats teachers used. The class measure also helped us assess instructional support. And here we were able to understand concept development as well as feedback given between the teachers and the students. So here's what we learned. We learned that responsive classrooms did look different from typical classrooms. However, random assignments alone did not predict the different quality of interactions. Instead, it was the use of the practices. So classrooms where they used more of these responsive classroom practices, those classrooms were higher in emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. Let's look at some specific responsive classroom practices and how those practices related to the quality of teacher-student interactions. So first I'll call attention to emotional support. And you can see that classrooms using learning meeting as well as classrooms using academic choice provided more emotional support for students. Next we looked at classroom organization and organizational support. And we saw that use of morning meeting and use of interactive modeling related to more organized and productive classrooms. So we know that teachers are being encouraged to use standards-based practices in math given the Common Core. So we conducted a set of observations in math classrooms in order to understand and examine the extent to which the responsive classroom approach helps support or doesn't help support the use of standards-based math practices. So here we use the M-SCAN measure. The M-SCAN measure is an observational measure. It looks at the coherence of the lesson, the discourse that the students and teachers are using to talk about math. It talks about the use of mathematical representations as well as the translation amongst those representations. And it talks about the structure of the tasks and the accuracy of those tasks that teachers are presenting to students. So here I'll be describing some findings from third grade. What we found is that responsive classrooms look very different from the typical classroom in math. And responsive classrooms were more likely to show higher scores on these indicators of standards-based math practices. So let's go to a few lessons learned here. We see that use of responsive classroom practices appears to improve the quality of classroom interactions, and we learned that responsive classroom practices related to greater emotional support and improved classroom organization in particular, as well as more use of standards-based math instruction. Okay, that brings us to the final question that I often receive from teachers and principals. People will ask me and others, what is the most important point to keep in mind to know whether responsive classroom is right for my school? Well, obviously I can't easily answer that question. You're all at a lot of different schools and there are a lot of different local conditions that matter. But what I can do is I can provide you with some information based on our data that might be useful as you're making this decision, as you're thinking this through. So all of our findings, if I had to summarize them into one take-home message, I would say that it's the actual use of the practices that matter for student and teacher outcomes, not whether you're automatically assigned to an intervention or control condition. The reason for this is that we know that teachers and schools vary in their uptake of responsive classroom practices. And that means that we need to consider the supportiveness of school conditions for understanding the uptake of responsive classroom practices. So we asked groups of 3rd and 4th grade teachers about what conditions supported or challenged their use of responsive classroom practices. And here's what we learned. So teachers talked about the supports that were important to them. And they talked about principal buy-in as being very important. So they talked about the principal's motivation, for instance. Did they feel like their principal really wanted responsive classroom to happen at their school? They talked about the importance of consistency at their school. So for example, are many of the teachers using the responsive classroom practices at their school? And they also talked about the principal or their school leader making accommodations for responsive classroom to take hold. So for example, one teacher described that there was a school-wide vision about morning meeting and that was held as a very special time in the schedule. The teachers also talked about the importance of coaching. They thought that the coaching really helped them in learning the responsive classroom practices because it provided some real-world applications and because of the ability to receive on-demand resources. Teachers also talked about the feelings of psychological safety at their school. So they were more likely to use responsive classroom approach when they felt validated and when they felt validation for the use of those practices. They also talked about the ability to adopt responsive classroom at their own pace and also the presence of social support in their efforts to adopt responsive classroom. So teachers also talked about the things that were very challenging to them as they were trying to adopt the responsive classroom practices. They pointed out that the presence of too many programs at once made it very difficult to learn a new set of practices. Teachers talked about having programs at their schools that had conflicting content, and that made it difficult to use the practices. And teachers also talked about unsupportive leadership when they felt that the schools were not necessarily all on board or that the leaders were not on board with responsive classroom, that made it a difficult situation for them as they were trying to learn a new set of strategies for their classrooms. That brings us back to the issue and the question that I raised in the beginning of the talk. What happens when schools and classrooms focus both on social and academic learning? Well, our work on the responsive classroom could be best summarized this way. When teachers were well supported to learn responsive classroom practices, two positive outcomes became evident. The teachers showed improved interactions with students, and students showed some evidence of achievement gains. Thank you for your attention. These are the acknowledgments that I'd like to share with you all. And we're prepared for some questions.
Hi Sarah, we've had questions coming in throughout your presentation. The webinar was originally scheduled to end at 12:30 for the presentation portion, but we'd like to keep the session open until 1 o'clock to field any questions that participants may have. For participants, please use the chat supervised box on the left-hand side of your screen to ask any questions you have at this time. For those of you who cannot remain on the session for the full time, thank you for joining us, and please look out for the recorded session, which will be available on the Responsive Classroom website as well as the CoLab site. The first question we have is regarding fidelity of implementation. Sarah, could you please elaborate on how fidelity to RC was calculated?
Sure, happy to do that. So here's what we did. We had teachers report on their use of practices, and we had teachers at both intervention schools and comparison schools report on that. And they reported in two ways. They reported on looking at how frequently they used some of the responsive classroom practices, and then also on their quality or their adherence to those practices, so the way that they were using those practices. And those measures describe responsive classroom practices in a way that didn't use any responsive classroom language. So for example, it would say, does your classroom gather in the morning, or does your classroom gather for morning exercises? And that would be, if teachers were high on that, they'd be high on the measure of responsive classroom. And that you may say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean they're doing a morning meeting, but there were 44 items on that questionnaire, so taken together, that helps. Then there's a 11-item questionnaire about the frequency of use of practices. And then we had a 16-item observation checklist. And when our observers were in the classroom, they conducted these observations of teachers' use of the responsive classroom practices. and our observers did not have training in responsive classroom, so they were looking for evidence of responsive classroom practices in the classroom. Now, then what we did is we used a set of statistical procedures to come up with a single factor score that included all of those 3 measures. And so we used a composite that reflected those 3 different measures. Now, those measures we've gathered up, and they're on the CoLab site, the University of Virginia CoLab site. And so if you'd like to take a look at those measures, we welcome you to go ahead and take a look.
Okay, the second question is regarding good ways to start responsive classroom in schools that have limited funding. This educator says, I can't afford to go to a workshop, but love the idea. What is a good way to start? I am the only educator in my school who has heard of this.
Oh, interesting. Well, in some regards, that is a better question for NESC than for me. I will point out that when you looked at those scatter plots, you could see that there are a variety of different ways of learning these practices, and it's the use of the practices that ends up being very important. So I would talk to the people at NESC, and I think they'll be able to recommend some approaches.
Okay. The next question is regarding how RC works equally for all children. Was there any work done on correlations with race as opposed to simply socioeconomic status?
No, we did not do those analyses.
Okay. The next question is regarding more specific to responsive classroom. Tristan is wondering about the 7 RC principles and practices. Is there a resource that they can go to learn more about the practices and principles of RC?
I would go to the Northeast Foundation for Children website. It's www.responsiveclassroom.org.
Okay. We have another question that's regarding RC connection to emotionally disabled youngsters. Is there any information or tools from the Northeast Foundation for Children about how to implement RC for children with emotional disabilities?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that some of the children that might have been classified that way were included in our sample, but were not necessarily included in our analyses. And I do know that NESC did conduct some workshops with special educators at our schools, but I would turn to NESC for the answer to that question.
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in a short period of time, so bear with me for a second here. This teacher is asking about the materials used in efficacy studies, such as the teacher surveys, to be available for schools teams that would like to study the efficacy of RC in their school.
Mm-hmm. Oh, is that the question?
Yeah. Okay. Great.
I firmly hold the belief that when we develop a measure as a team, that we want that measure to be able to be used and shared. And so we put all of those measures up on our website and on the CoLab site, and they will also be on our Social Development Lab website, and so that you can access them. And we encourage you to read the instructions carefully and go ahead and use them in your schools. And you may come up with very creative ways of using those measures to give feedback to teachers or look at growth and change over time. And I encourage you to do that.
Okay, the next question is asking to elaborate a little more on the explanation of the overall math test score gain. Approximately how many percentage point gains were there on math test scores in the responsive classroom?
Okay, let me pull up something that I wrote down because it helps me translate the effect sizes into something that will be more meaningful. Okay. For math, I'll start with the effect size gain. So this is an effect size it's actually not an effect size gain, it's an effect size difference between intervention schools using responsive classroom practices. This is showing this is an effect size difference, effect size relationship for use of responsive classroom practices to achievement. The effect sizes were 0.26 for math and 0.30 for reading. So in other words, that's about 1/4 of a standard deviation in math and about 1/3 of a standard deviation in reading. So if you look at your achievement test that you use, your state achievement test, and you look at what is the mean and what is the standard deviation, then based on that you can estimate what is about 1/4 of the standard deviation, what is about 1/3 of the standard deviation. And that is how you can translate that into the number of points that would be comparable in the test that you're using. Another way to think about it, so let me repeat that again. So it'd be 1/4 of the standard deviation in math, 1/3 of the standard deviation in reading. If you go and you take your test scores and you find the mean, you find the standard deviation, you can, for that test, you can estimate what 1/4 of the standard deviation would be and what 1/3 of the standard deviation would be. And that's the relationship between the use of those practices and the achievement outcomes. Another way to think about it is that for math, 67% of the students in the treatment group scored higher than the mean for the control group. For math, 67% of the students in the treatment group who were receiving responsive classroom practices scored higher than the mean for the control group. For reading, 70% of the students in the treatment group who were receiving responsive classroom practices showed higher scores than the mean of the control group. So you can think of the control group is at this, or the mean of the control group is at this 50%, and so then you can talk about what percentage of the students over that in the treatment group who are receiving practices.
The next question is about English language learners, and this participant is interested in whether or not there were any English language learners in the study.
That's a good question. So one of the things that's important to keep in mind when you're asking about how these findings relate to your district is what kind of district did we work with, and what were the demographic characteristics of the district that we worked with. So on average, we had about 50% who were ethnic minority students, and about 30% who were students who were eligible for free and reduced lunch. And we also had a very high percentage, I think it's around 20 to 30% of students who were English language learners. And we actually conducted some analyses to see if the achievement outcomes were different or not for English language learners, and we found no difference for English language learners compared to students who where English was their first language.
Okay, the next question is from a parent that's interested in responsive classroom, and they're wondering if you have any recommendations on how to introduce their child's school to responsive classroom approach.
I am guessing that Northeast Foundation for Children has received that question a lot, and my thoughts are to look at some of the books that they produce or use some of those books. It would also be a good question to ask them directly.
And just to clarify for participants, the Responsive Classroom website link will be available at the end of this presentation. The next question is about school-wide versus implementation of RC practices for an independent teacher or in the classroom. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of school-wide versus independent implementation?
Well, what it comes down to is, well, our analyses, many of our analyses looked at the unit of the school, and then many of our analyses looked at the unit of the teacher. But essentially what it comes down to is the use of the practices. So to the extent that when a whole school adopts, if that supports the use of practices in individual classrooms, that's a good thing. If it doesn't, then it's not necessarily a good thing. So it has to do with the actual use of practices. Everything comes down to that single issue about use of practices or not use, with the idea that there's very uneven uptake in the use of those practices, typically.
Okay. The next question is regarding specific use of RP practices. Are there some practices that are more influential in child outcomes than others?
Well, we were able to measure and examine 3 practices very carefully: morning meeting, interactive modeling, and academic choice. And we have some preliminary analyses that suggest that academic choice ended up being something that related to academic achievement in a positive direction.
Okay, just a second. Trying to feel through all the questions that are coming in quickly. Okay, this question is specifically related to the scatter plot diagram of mathematics outcomes. And they're wondering more about the other variables we mentioned and how those were accounted for, such as free and reduced price lunch and the effects of math scores, intervention versus control. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that those analyses control for that. And so what they do is they account for that statistically in the analysis. So it's almost like we know that free and reduced price lunch relates to achievement outcomes, at least in these data and other data sets I've seen as well. And so there's a way to kind of control for that or handle that or manage that statistically in understanding what other findings are left in the data.
This question is asking more about the demographics of the district in which we performed this study. Specifically, what the percentage of English language learners was.
You know, I think it's 20 to 30%. Is that right?
That's what. Yeah.
And one thing that's unique about this is, and this isn't the district as a whole. Our schools, I think, are at around 20 to 30%. And one thing that's unique about it is that they are very mixed languages. So there's a big mix of languages used. It's not only Spanish-speaking students or another language. There's a real mix of languages.
The next question you may have touched on already, speaking about fidelity of implementation. This participant is interested in the observation tools used and whether they were designed specifically for the study or if existing measures were already used.
We had a former graduate student of mine work on this, and with several other people. And NEMC does have a book that they've put out that has elements of our measure our measure was co-developed with that book. It's a book by Paula Denton, and I think it's available on their website. And it provides some guidance for looking for certain behaviors in the schools.
Okay, I don't see any additional questions coming in at this time. Maybe we'll give the participants a minute or so to see if anything comes to mind. If there are no additional questions, we'll go ahead and direct the participants to the follow-up links that we'll have available, and go ahead and change to that slide. So any additional questions or comments that you may have or think of after the conclusion of this webinar, please send them to the castle@virginia.edu email address listed here. There will also be a recording of this webinar that will be provided on the Responsive Classroom website, which Sarah mentioned many times, and there it is for you to see how the direct link and how it's spelled out. And then for further information on education research that's being performed here at the University of Virginia, please visit the following 2 websites that we have listed there. I think a couple of questions have come in the meantime, so this is asking about maybe another question that's best suited for the Northeast Foundation for Children, but we're looking for some advice on how to present the evidence from the responsive classroom efficacy studies to school boards.
There's a very short one-pager that is up on the CoLab website that might be useful. These slides will be posted as well. And then our team is in the process of writing additional documents that will become available. And what we will do is, as those become available, we will put them up on the CoLab site, and you'll receive an email that will say, oh, this new document's available, and summarizes the research. And hopefully those materials will be useful in looking through your, to help your understanding of the work. It's also important to keep in mind that it will take a little while to get all of those documents prepared because, like I mentioned, many of these papers are still under peer review and there are lots of nuances to these findings. So some of the findings could shift and change a little bit between now and then.
Okay, we have another question regarding how best to involve parents in the responsive classroom approach.
Involving parents is clearly in the domain of Northeast Foundation for Children, and we'll be able to talk with you about that.
We have a question for participants that wants to know what is really exciting to you about your research and this study's results.
I'm so glad you asked. I've been waiting for that. I think the thing that is really exciting about this work is being able to quantify and question practices that seem theoretically well-grounded, but trying to understand them and understand them in light of real data. And I think one of the, when I look at a lot of teacher education books, for example, I see a real emphasis on from theory to practice. And what I think is that it should be from theory to research to practice. And the idea is that if we have research, we can better understand what parts of the intervention are helping and not helping, for whom does it help. We can start to understand, are there ways to change practices that are being used in schools to be better. And so some of the information we're sharing with Northeast Foundation for Children so that they can reflect on responsive classroom as well. So I find the applied nature of this work very exciting.
Okay, here's a question about the grades that were researched in the study and what grades are appropriate for implementing the responsive classroom approach.
The responsive classroom is designed for grades K through 6. We focused on grades 3, 4, and 5 in our research.
Okay, we have a couple more questions coming in. This may be a good question to finish on if no others come in, and that is, will our observations continue, and what is the future of responsive classroom research or any further study-related next steps?
I see a few next steps. There are a few different possibilities. I think that it's important to replicate these types of findings, and that's something I'm interested in doing. Is looking for a different type of district with different demographic characteristics and essentially doing a very similar study to this one with more emphasis on some questions that we still don't have answers to. And then we can see, okay, to whom can we generalize? Do these findings generalize or not generalize? The other thing that I think is kind of a worthwhile direction for this is to think about how this fits with various content areas that are used in schools and trying to understand that as well. And then the third thing that comes to mind, and this is also something that I'm thinking about doing, is I'd like to follow these students up into their middle school years and gather data and see if there's any long-term effects. So we know that in educational research, it's very tricky to find interventions that produce long-term effects. It's not clear why that's so challenging to find, but that's something I'd like to look at with responsive classroom.
There are a few more questions that have come up. I don't know if you want to address them now, or if you think that's a good place to stop. And
I think we could go till, we have till 1 o'clock, is that right? Let's go till 1 o'clock, and then we'll stop.
The next question is regarding curricula. Were the schools using, which curricula were the schools using to teach math and reading? How many of their teachers were writing their own curricula? Which curricula do you believe are the most compatible with the RC approach?
Okay. I don't have the answer to the question of which curricula are most compatible with the responsive classroom approach. What I can say is when we asked about the curricula that were used in this district, it was a variety of different, we only asked about math curricula for the purposes of our study, but we heard a variety of different answers. Some of them were more inquiry-based, some of them were more traditional, some of them, all of them were built around the standards for the state tests, and there were some guides in relation to those standards. And so in some cases, when we asked the school what curriculum they were using, they referred to those state standards.
This question is, what recommendations or advice might you have for teachers who are highly effective and resistant to taking on RC practices because they feel like what they are doing is already effective?
That's a very tricky question. So here's the thing, is that we know it's use of the practices that relates to achievement. And so we can't say, so it could be that there's some qualities of teachers that predict the use of practices and that also predict the teacher's ability to create improved achievement. So we don't know whether it's some characteristic of the teacher that predicts both use of those practices and the achievement or not. And so it is possible. So as we try to think about that, it is possible to have to think very carefully about when a teacher is resistant to this type of change, what kinds of, what's the source of the resistance, and what is that teacher producing achievement gains? Is the teacher supporting students' achievement growth? So one thing that happens in some interventions, and may be also the case with responsive classroom, is that if a teacher has a particular way of teaching and they use an intervention and they don't use it well, it can interrupt the good things that are already happening in a classroom. So this is the kind of thing that needs to be handled very carefully and thoughtfully.
The next question is regarding following up, and I mentioned potentially replicating the study in another district. This participant is interested in how you'll decide what kind of district you want to use to replicate the study and how those decisions or the processes.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a conversation I'll probably have with Northeast Deaf Foundation for Children, and in preparing a replication grant, the question that I would ask of any FC is I would say, have you had any districts contact you that say, boy, we'd love to do this in our district, that we'd love to be part of research on responsive classroom. And so I invite you to either contact me with that information, if that's the case, or contact any FC. And it really does, it is very helpful to find districts who are interested in engaging in this type of work. We're able to do the research in remote locations, not that remote, meaning not in Charlottesville, not at UVA necessarily. We can do it elsewhere because we use so much videotaping and we use the web for surveys and things like that. So I encourage you to either contact us or contact any FC about that.
Okay, we have that question. I think that concludes the question and answer session. What I would like to do is direct participants again to that capital@virginia.edu email address. If we receive further questions following the webinar, we will create a frequently asked questions document to answer any unanswered or further questions, and an email will be sent out through CoLab to all participants once this document is completed. So They should definitely be on the lookout for that.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.